In 1876, a British explorer named Henry Wickham chartered a steamship on the Amazon River, loaded it with 70,000 seeds, and sailed them out of Brazil without declaring them to customs. He later described the operation as a daring act of smuggling conducted under the noses of Brazilian authorities who would have confiscated the cargo had they understood what it was. The Brazilians told it differently. In Brazil, the story of Henry Wickham is not an adventure. It is a theft. The seeds he removed were rubber tree seeds, Hevea brasiliensis, the biological source of the most strategically important raw material of the industrial age. And their removal from Brazilian territory, in the specific manner that Wickham removed them, set in motion a chain of events that would collapse an empire, ignite a genocidal labor system in Central Africa, and determine the outcome of the Second World War. From 70,000 seeds. Carried out on a steamship by a man who, depending on which country's history you are reading, was either a patriotic hero of British commercial enterprise or the perpetrator of one of the most consequential acts of biopiracy in the history of the global economy. Both descriptions are accurate. And before this story is over, you will understand how a substance that drips from the bark of a tree became the most fought-over material on Earth, how it built cities in the middle of the Amazon jungle, how it killed more Congolese people than the Atlantic slave trade, how it caused a global crisis that lasted 30 years and ended only when a synthetic substitute was developed in the laboratories of Nazi Germany. All from a tree. That bleeds white. To understand why rubber was worth stealing, smuggling, killing for, and dying for across 2 centuries of industrial history, you have to understand what rubber does that nothing else on Earth can do. Natural rubber, the latex sap of the Hevea brasiliensis tree, is a polymer of isoprene molecules arranged in long, tangled chains that give the material a combination of properties that no synthetic substitute fully replicated until the mid-20th century. It stretches. It returns to its original shape. It seals against air and water with a completeness that no other naturally occurring material can match at equivalent cost. It insulates against electrical charge. It maintains these properties across a range of temperatures that would destroy most materials with similar characteristics. In a world without rubber, the Industrial Revolution stops. Not metaphorically, literally. The steam engine requires rubber gaskets to seal its joints against pressure. Without gaskets, the pressure escapes. Without pressure, the engine produces no useful work. Without engines, the factories stop. The trains stop. The ships stop. The bicycle requires rubber tires. The automobile requires rubber tires. Without tires, both remain engineering curiosities rather than transformative technologies. Electrical insulation in the 19th century required rubber. Without insulation, the telegraph cannot be laid underwater. The transatlantic cable that connected Europe and America for the first time in 1858 was insulated with gutta percha, a related natural polymer, but the principle was the same. Without insulation, the electrical grid cannot be built. Without the electrical grid, the 20th century does not exist in any recognizable form. Every single technology that defined the industrial age, steam, rail, electricity, pneumatic transport, internal combustion, required rubber at a fundamental level of its engineering. And for most of the 19th century, every single piece of that rubber came from one place, the Amazon basin. Specifically, from the territory of Brazil and its neighboring river systems, a geographic monopoly as complete in its economic consequences as the Chinese monopoly on silk or the Borrowdale monopoly on graphite. And like every monopoly in this series, it produced, at its peak, the specific combination of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary violence that monopoly power over an essential resource always eventually generates. The rubber boom that transformed the Amazon basin between approximately 1850 and 1912 produced one of the most bizarre urban phenomena in the history of human civilization: cities. In the middle of the jungle. Manaus, a city located approximately 1,500 kilometers from the Atlantic coast, accessible only by river, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of rainforest in every direction, became, in the 1880s and 1890s, one of the wealthiest cities per capita on Earth. The rubber barons who controlled the extraction and export of Amazonian latex built palaces with imported Italian marble. They sent their laundry to Lisbon because they believed Lisbon water produced better results than Amazon water. They installed electric streetlights before most European capitals had them. And in 1896, in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, 1,500 kilometers from the nearest city of comparable size, they built an opera house. The Teatro Amazonas, seating 700. Dome covered in 36,000 hand-painted ceramic tiles imported from Alsace-Lorraine. Interior fittings, chandeliers, columns, painted ceilings, imported from Europe at costs that would be extraordinary even by modern standards. An opera house, in the jungle, built with money that came from a tree that bled white. This is what monopoly over an essential industrial resource produces at its apex. And beneath the opera house, and the marble palaces, and the imported laundry arrangements, was the system that made all of it possible. It was not a system that anyone who attended the opera would have found it comfortable to describe. The rubber of the Amazon did not extract itself. It required tappers, seringueiros, men who walked circuits through the jungle, cutting the bark of rubber trees at specific angles, collecting the latex that dripped into clay cups, processing it into blocks, and carrying those blocks to river collection points, where they were purchased by the rubber barons, at prices the barons set unilaterally. The seringueiro system was not slavery in the legal sense that had been abolished in Brazil in 1888. It was something engineered to produce the same results without the legal classification. The rubber barons used a system called aviamento, a debt bondage arrangement, in which tappers were recruited from the drought-stricken northeast of Brazil, transported to the Amazon at the baron's expense, and then informed that the cost of their transportation, their tools, their food, and their housing had been added to a debt they were now required to work off. The debt was structured to be unpayable. The prices charged for necessities sold to the tappers by the rubber barons were set above the prices paid for the rubber the tappers collected. A tapper who worked an entire season could produce more latex than he had the previous season and still end the season deeper in debt than he began it. He could not leave. He had no money for transportation. He was hundreds of kilometers from any alternative employment. The baron's agents, called cantoneros, maintained the accounts and the physical control of the extraction territory. This was the system beneath the opera house. And in the Congo, under the administration of King Leopold II of Belgium, a version of the same system was operating at a scale and with a directness of violence that the Amazonian barons, who maintained at least the fiction of voluntary debt, did not attempt to match. Leopold II never visited the Congo. He acquired it, if that word can bear the weight of what it describes, through a diplomatic performance of extraordinary cynicism at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where the European powers divided Africa among themselves with a thoroughness and an indifference to the people living there that remains one of the most consequential acts of institutional violence in the history of the modern world. Leopold presented himself to the conference as a philanthropist. He proposed to develop the Congo Free State as a humanitarian mission, bringing civilization, Christianity, and commercial development to Central Africa in a spirit of benevolent trusteeship. The conference accepted his proposal. The Congo Free State was not a colony of Belgium. It was the personal property of Leopold II, held by him as a private investment, accountable to no parliament, no court, and no regulatory body of any kind. What Leopold found in the Congo was rubber, wild rubber, Landolphia vines that grew throughout the equatorial forest and produced latex that could be harvested by the same basic tapping process used in the Amazon. And what Leopold built to harvest it was a system so direct in its violence that even the standards of colonial administration in the late 19th century, which were not high, eventually produced an international outcry sufficient to force him to relinquish control. Congolese villages were assigned rubber quotas. Men who failed to meet their quotas were killed. As proof that bullets issued to the force publique, Leopold's private army, were being used for enforcement rather than wasted, soldiers were required to produce the severed hands of the people they killed. If a bullet was fired and a hand was not produced, the soldier was assumed to have wasted the ammunition. To avoid punishment, soldiers cut hands from living people, from workers who survived punitive violence, from children, from people who had nothing to do with rubber extraction at all. The severed hand became the administrative currency of the Congo Free State. Baskets of them were presented to district administrators as proof of quota enforcement. The population of the Congo during the Leopold period has been estimated to have declined by approximately 10 million people, through killing, starvation, disease, and the destruction of communities organized entirely around the extraction demands of a single man in Brussels who owned them as a private asset. 10 million people. For rubber, for the gaskets and the tires and the insulation that the industrial world needed and was not, in 1890, prepared to ask too carefully where they came from. Henry Wickham's 70,000 seeds, meanwhile, had arrived in England. They were planted at Kew Gardens. Of the 70,000, approximately 2,800 germinated. The seedlings were shipped to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and to British Malaya, where the colonial administration of the British Empire had identified climatic and soil conditions similar enough to the Amazon to support Hevea brasiliensis cultivation. The plantation model, organized, systematic, efficient, produced something the Amazon's wild rubber system structurally could not: consistency. Wild rubber extraction depended on tappers walking circuits through jungle containing trees they did not own, could not manage, and could not increase in density. The yield per acre was fixed by the distribution of wild trees in the forest. A plantation could be designed. Density could be optimized. Tapping cycles could be calibrated to maximize yield without killing the tree. Quality could be controlled at the point of production rather than at the point of export. By 1910, British Malayan plantations were producing rubber at a cost per kilogram that undercut Brazilian wild rubber by more than half. By 1912, the Amazon rubber boom was over. Manaus, the city with the opera house, the marble palaces, the Lisbon laundry, collapsed with a speed that mirrored its rise. The rubber barons lost their fortunes within years. The electric streetlights went dark. The opera house closed. The Teatro Amazonas sat empty and deteriorating in the jungle for decades. It was restored in the 1990s. It still stands. The ceramic tiles still catch the light. The empire it represented lasted approximately 30 years. The British plantation monopoly that replaced the Amazon monopoly faced its own existential challenge 20 years later, from a direction that neither Wickham nor the Kew Gardens botanists had anticipated. Japan. In December 1941, Japan's military expansion across Southeast Asia accomplished, in a matter of months, the conquest of British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and virtually every significant rubber-producing territory in the world outside of South America. The Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and their partners, found themselves fighting the largest war in human history with access to approximately 6% of their previous rubber supply. Everything that required rubber, tires, gaskets, life rafts, gas masks, boots, medical equipment, electrical insulation, was simultaneously essential to the war effort and functionally unavailable in the quantities required to conduct it. The United States government declared rubber a strategic material of the highest priority. Scrap rubber drives collected worn tires, garden hoses, raincoats, and anything else containing rubber from the civilian population. Speed limits were reduced to 35 miles per hour nationally, not primarily to save fuel, but to reduce tire wear and extend the life of existing rubber stocks. None of it was enough. What was enough, what solved the rubber crisis with the speed and scale the war required, was science. Synthetic rubber, specifically the GRS formulation, developed by a collaboration between American chemical companies and government research programs, that, in the period between 1942 and 1945, built from essentially nothing the largest synthetic rubber industry in history. By 1944, the United States was producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year. By 1945, synthetic rubber had largely replaced natural rubber in American military production. The Hevea brasiliensis tree, the one whose seeds Wickham smuggled out of Brazil in 1876, whose latex had built Manaus and destroyed the Congo and determined the economics of the industrial age for a century, had been made optional. Not obsolete. Natural rubber retains specific performance characteristics that synthetic rubber still does not fully replicate. Surgical gloves, aircraft tires, and certain high-performance applications still require natural latex. The rubber plantation industry of Southeast Asia still produces millions of tons annually. But the monopoly was broken. The strategic vulnerability was closed. The wars fought over access to a single tree's sap. The Congolese dead. The Amazonian seringueiros in their unpayable debt. The Allied soldiers driving at 35 miles per hour to save their tires. All of it pointed toward a laboratory in New Jersey, where chemists spent 3 years figuring out how to make a polymer in a reaction vessel that used to grow only in a tree. Henry Wickham received a knighthood for his services to the British Empire. Brazil called him a biopirate for over a century. The Brazilian Congress debated legislation in the 2000s that would have classified what he did in 1876 as an act of economic aggression against the Brazilian state. The legislation did not pass. The rubber trees planted from Wickham's seeds now cover approximately 3 million hectares of Southeast Asian plantation land, producing roughly 7 million tons of natural rubber per year, employing millions of people across Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and their neighbors. None of the revenue from that production flows to Brazil. None of it has, since 1876. The Congo Free State became the Belgian Congo in 1908, when international pressure forced Leopold to relinquish personal control. It became the Democratic Republic of Congo at independence in 1960. The 10 million people who died during the rubber extraction period have no monument in Brussels, where Leopold's statues stood in public squares until protesters pulled several of them down in 2020. The 70,000 seeds that Wickham loaded onto a steamship on the Amazon River carried inside them an empire's worth of consequences that no one loading them could have fully calculated. A city with an opera house in the jungle. 10 million dead in a forest in Africa. A world war's logistics determined by access to a polymer. A laboratory in New Jersey racing to replace what a tree had been doing for free. All of it from a substance that drips, white and slow, from a cut in the bark of a tree, that a man put on a boat and sailed away with, without declaring it to customers.